Welcome to Making Special Education Actually Work, an online publication presented in blog and podcast form by KPS for Parents. As an added benefit to our subscribers and visitors to our site, we're making podcast versions of our text-only blog articles so that you can get the information you need on the go by downloading and listening at your convenience. We also occasionally conduct discussions with guest speakers via our podcasts and transcribe the audio into text for our followers who prefer to read the content on our blog. Where the use of visual aids, legal citations, and references to other websites are used to better illustrate our points and help you understand the information, these tools appear in the text-only portion of the blog post of which this podcast is a part. You will hear a distinctive sound during this podcast whenever reference is made to content that includes a link to another article, website, or download. Please refer back to the original blog article to access these resources. Today is April 6, 2025. This post and podcast is titled Using ABA to Identify and Deal with Misinformation, in which we discuss how we have historically used ABA to address challenging behaviors in our line of work and how that knowledge can be generalized and shared with others to help enhance their problem-solving skills when it comes to misinformation. Special education and disability-related areas of civil rights law are complex systems of law and science that require an understanding of how an individual person is impacted by their unique disabilities within the unique context of their unique individual lives. The whole person has to be taken into account in order to determine the degree to which their disabilities impact their activities of daily living, or ADLs, which includes learning, employment, and community access. In special education, the presence of disability alone does not automatically make a student eligible for special education, though it still makes them protected under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. In special education, having a disability satisfies only one prong of a two-pronged line of inquiry that requires, upon evidence of a disability, further evidence that the disability interferes with the student's access to education in some kind of meaningful way that requires specialized instruction in some form. In some states, such as California, if a student demonstrates a speech and/or language impairment such that they satisfy the speech language impaired or SLI eligibility category pursuant to the regulations and require speech language services but not specialized academic instruction or SAI, the speech language services can be considered SAI for the purposes of finding the student eligible for special education. This is because public school instruction is so heavily weighted on language that having intact language skills is necessary for accessing the instruction. That said, many students, particularly those found eligible under the autism or OT criteria, experience significant impairments in pragmatic language that may not interfere with their academics in most cases, but greatly interfere with their ability to interact in socially appropriate ways with others. This can impact their peer interactions during unstructured times like lunch and recess or passing periods, participation in group learning activities in the classroom, safe behavior during school drills or actual emergencies, etc. Addressing these kinds of challenges through special education can be just as educationally necessary as addressing the academic needs of a child with an intellectual disability, profound medical condition, or learning disability. Figuring out who needs what, if anything, in special education requires an expert level of assessment and data analyses. Furthermore, special education is a regulated process. Local education agencies have to abide by the rules attached to the federal special education dollars in order for their states to receive said dollars. Compliance with 504 is non-optional for any entity receiving federal dollars of any kind, such as public schools, and compliance with the ADA is mandatory, period. Federal special education law mandates the application of the peer-reviewed research to the design and delivery of special education to the degree doing so is practicable. This means that approaches that have already been proven to work, that is, evidence-based practices, must be used when addressing the individual needs of each special education student pursuant to the applicable regulations. In theory, logic should prevail under the circumstances. However, as the whole world is now seeing firsthand, the government in America has always been infiltrated by anti democratic thinkers and morons who have no idea what they are doing. Sometimes these people are one and the same. Not to say I told you so, but back when people kept comparing me to Don Quixote when I'd make a stink about special education violations as a matter of a departure from the rule of law by local government agencies, I kept telling people that special education was the canary in the coal mine for democracy in this country. The measure of how civilized a society is goes to how well it takes care of its most vulnerable members. If the civil rights of children with disabilities means nothing, no one's rights mean anything. If one of us is denied liberty, all of us are denied liberty. There cannot be any class of humans who are excluded from human rights in a civilized society. But there are many mentally ill people currently in power who regard other people with disabilities as useless eaters. The irony that this is the mentally ill calling other people with disabilities unworthy of life doesn't escape me. Only broken minds do the kinds of things we're seeing happen within American government at the federal level right now. This is what I was up against for the first 25 years of my career at the local and state level. It's now finally escalated up the food chain to the national level, such that now it's finally affecting everyone and not just marginalized populations. Police are now putting up barricades and blocking off streets so that white people can safely, peacefully protest instead of beating and arresting them like they have when black and brown people have peacefully protested in the streets. White people aren't being disappeared to El Salvador yet, but the writing is on the wall if the American public doesn't unite against what is happening right now. It's a lot to process, but for those of us who have been fighting this affront to democracy through official channels for decades, the narcissistic abuses of power by government officials are all too familiar to us. Interestingly, at the local level, the energy has shifted in the last 15 to 20 years as more old crooked cronies retire or move on, and more young people fresh out of graduate school come in to inherit the messes left behind by the crooked old cronies they replaced. These science minded, pro democracy young public servants are inadequately trained on how to apply the science in the field and the regulatory process that describes how they are supposed to do it. None of the systems they have inherited lend themselves to complying with the law. They're broken and fraught with decades of mismanagement. I'm finding as I go to IEP meetings that I am a welcome member of the team because I've been around long enough to know the applicable science and law, and I've been trying to prevent the harm done by the old crony since 1991. At this stage in my career, I'm spending more time helping IEP teams create legally compliant IEPs that deliver meaningful educational and therapeutic results as appropriate to the individual needs of the student, and far less time fighting with school districts over whether or not to assess a student, amend an IEP goal, provide a service, or change a placement. It appears that the toxic energy that I was up against previously has moved on in the pursuit of power to higher offices where people are less familiar with contending with these types of behaviors. Part of what keeps people like this in power for so long is that they lie, withhold information, spoliate evidence, violate privacy rights, engage in gaslighting, and are often really good at finding someone else to be their scapegoat to take the fall if they get caught doing something wrong. It all catches up with them eventually, but there is a wake of destruction behind them 100 miles wide by the time that happens, and remedial compensatory strategies that are eventually forthcoming never make the injured parties fully whole. America is going through something akin to one of my worst case scenarios in a special education advocacy case, which I've not had to deal with since 2005 to 2012. The worst case scenario is when, despite my best efforts to keep things scientifically valid and procedurally compliant, I was unable to get an appropriate program for a student, at which point I'd pull in an attorney to file for due process to fight for an appropriate individualized education program or IEP for the student pursuant to the regulations and applicable peer reviewed research. Worst case scenario, the losing party in the due process case appeals to the federal district court in the student's local area, which can delay some remedies for 2 to 5 years. If the district court matter is appealed, it goes to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. If I never have to work on another table of uncontroverted facts again for the rest of my life, it will be too soon. The tedium and detail required is like trying to paint the Mona Lisa on a grain of rice with an eyelash. It can also further delay resolution by another year or two. In short, litigation blows. I'll do it if I have to because that's the only lawful process to resolve violations of the law committed by government officials to the detriment of children with disabilities that I've got. But I'll resent the hell out of everybody who has made it necessary for me to put forth that kind of effort to resolve a problem they created. It's an act of patriotism and protectiveness of children with disabilities that I do it. It's out of necessity because I can and most people can't. That's got to change. More people need to know what I know so that they can be better advocates for democracy in their own lives, however it might uniquely manifest. There has to be a way for me to share the knowledge I have about how pro democratic people can handle anti democratic people they encounter in their day to day lives. A democracy of the people, for the people, and by the people is upheld when all the people work together in a manner that makes them woven together like fabric to make up the fabric of the community in which they live. Or, to quote guerrilla gardener Ron Finley, to change the community, we have to change the composition of the soil. We are the soil. Community building is a lot like building up soil for planting and growing food. In order for people to weave together into a fabric that creates a healthy society, the people themselves need to be socially emotionally healthy. If we are all collectively the soil needs to be amended because not everyone is getting the nutrients they need in order for us to all interact together in a mutually beneficial and healthy way. To that end, I want to put it out there that I think there needs to be every person's version of basic applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, taught at the high school level as part of every student's health curriculum, along with instruction regarding how to discern truth from fiction in media of all forms. Civics classes should also include examinations of propaganda efforts in the past and present around the world that are used to subjugate people and deprive them of their freedoms, and how that compares against the United States Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and our system of three equal branches of government at the federal level for the purpose of checks and balances. With respect to ABA, this is something the general public should really understand, and it honestly isn't that complicated. For the purpose of educating the public and helping people equip themselves with a way of thinking about behavior that will serve them for the rest of their lives, I'm offering a basic breakdown of the applicable science here. The first thing to understand about ABA is that there is no trying to figure out what someone is thinking or feeling involved. You can't observe what's going on in someone's mind or how their body feels inside, and you can't make any informed decisions in ABA about things you can't observe and measure. As such, only objective, observable behaviors can be used to inform an ABA analysis of any kind. Internal thoughts and feelings are referred to as private events in ABA. This actually helps you be more methodical and less emotionally biased about your data because you're purely working from what anyone can observe and measuring it in meaningful ways. For example, what is the frequency, intensity, and duration of an inappropriate behavior that you are witnessing? All of those things can be quantified in some kind of way. Another important data collection tool in ABA is called ABC data collection. Here, A stands for antecedent, B stands for behavior, and C stands for consequence. An antecedent is whatever happened just before the behavior that triggered it. The behavior is the behavior you're analyzing. The consequence is the outcome naturally produced by the behavior. ABC data is taken to determine the function of a behavior. The function of a behavior is indicated by the degree to which the consequence rewards the behavior and thus encourages it to happen again under similar circumstances in the future. The more often a behavior is rewarded, the more likely it is to occur again. This rewarding of a specific behavior is called reinforcement and can come in various forms. Many people misuse the term positive and negative with respect to reinforcement, and that really undermines their ability to accurately apply the science. Positive and negative no more means good and bad with respect to reinforcement as they do to the poles on a magnet or a battery. This is science. Positive and negative are neutral terms that have nothing to do with emotions or judgment. In ABA, positive means to present, and negative means to withdraw. Therefore, positive reinforcement occurs when something desired by the individual is received in response to a specific behavior. and negative reinforcement occurs when something aversive to the individual is taken away in response to a specific behavior. One of the best research examples of that was B.F. Skinner's experiments with rats. He created what came to be known as Skinner boxes, in which different tests were conducted with rats to study positive and negative reinforcement. In one box, a rat would have a lever built into the cage that, if pulled by the rat, would dispense a food pellet, thereby positively reinforcing the behavior of lever pulling. In another box, the floor of the cage would carry a mild electrical current that was unpleasant but not painful to the rat, which it could turn off by pulling a lever, which thereby negatively reinforced the behavior of lever pulling. In both instances, the rats learned to pull the lever, but in each trial in which this experiment was conducted, the rat who had been positively reinforced seemed to be better off at the end of the experiment than the rat that had been negatively reinforced. The conclusion was that reinforcing a behavior increases its likelihood of occurring again in the future under similar circumstances, but positive reinforcement is usually the more ethical form of reinforcement and it's highly effective. In some instances, negative reinforcement can be a good thing. Removing something non preferred in exchange for specific behaviors is negative reinforcement, and that isn't always bad. Reducing the amount of time a teenager is grounded for being behind in their homework according to how much of it they complete can reinforce the behavior of completing their incomplete homework. Reducing the number of math problems they have to complete if they can show mastery with just a few reinforces the behavior of diligent application of math knowledge. I'll gladly vacuum the living room if someone else scrubs the toilet. Let me escape the aversive task of scrubbing the toilet, and I will engage in the behavior of vacuuming the living room. But the science shows that working for rewards is a more powerful and emotionally healthy motivator than working to escape punishment. The whole positive and negative thing applies to punishment as well. Positive punishment is the presentation of something aversive in response to a specific behavior. Negative punishment is the withdrawal of something preferred in response to a specific behavior. The effectiveness and ethics of punishment are a mirror image of reinforcement. Negative punishment can be far less harsh and more effective than positive punishment. In ABA, punishment is also referred to as a response cost. The intent of punishment is to serve up a consequence that is unlikely to reinforce the behavior from happening again under similar circumstances. Negative punishment can be taking away the Wi Fi by changing the password until all the clean dishes in the dishwasher have been put away and the dirty dishes have been loaded into it like some young person's chores list says they're supposed to do. Giving them the new Wi Fi password once the dishes are done positively reinforces doing the dishes. There's a time and a place for everything. Positive punishment in its ugliest form is abuse. It's usually the least effective and ethical approach to use. However, as I said, there is a time and a place for everything. Sometimes consequences have to hurt badly before the lesson is learned, as a lot of pro 47 investors are starting to realize these days. Another ABA concept that people need to understand and master is that of the extinction burst. There is misinformation about what this term means floating around out there, and it doesn't simply refer to the death throes of a behavior on its way out. That grossly oversimplifies the whole situation. An extinction burst occurs when a behavior that was previously reinforced is no longer being reinforced. The individual escalates their behavior in an effort to force the reinforcer to nonetheless come. For example, if you put money in a vending machine and a candy bar comes out every time, the candy bar consistently reinforces the behavior of putting money in the machine. If, however, the candy bar gets stuck in the machine and won't come out one day, we don't walk away sad never to use the machine again. We kick the crap out of the machine until the candy bar falls out. We only give up on the machine if kicking it doesn't work. After that, we'll stop using the machine, and the machine using behavior will become extinct. We might replace that behavior with another behavior like using a different vending machine or buying snacks at the store, but we won't go back to the machine that stole our money and candy again. A lot of the insane behaviors we're seeing at the federal level are an extinction burst of a sort on behalf of old rich white men who have gotten away with horrible things their entire lives and are just trying to maintain until they die. They are pulling every last desperate stunt they can think of to hold on to the power they managed to acquire over time through unscrupulous means in what was never an indefinitely sustainable plan due to its inherent flaws and departure from morality, as their house of cards finally starts to fall. And they don't care who they hurt in the process, least of all children with disabilities who they regard as useless eaters. What we cannot do is reinforce their behaviors. We have to starve their behaviors of rewards and met out response costs where appropriate, which seems to be in a whole lot of cases. This is going to burden our judiciary for a long time to come, but it will also likely make the careers of up and coming attorneys and judges who come down on the right side of the rule of law, save democracy, and make history. Our system of checks and balances are being put to the test, and our judiciary is largely standing up to the assault on our democracy that the executive branch is leading. In our day to day lives, when we encounter the kinds of people who are swayed by the influence of 47 and his minions, we need to go in understanding that logic will not serve us, and understanding the functions of their behaviors will get us much further. What is the thing that happened right before they did whatever they did that has us concerned? That's our antecedent. What was the consequence they received immediately after engaging in the behavior? Did the consequence reward or punish their behavior, or did it have a neutral effect? If you can learn to read the room according to the basic principles of ABA, it's like Neo seeing the matrix in code rather than as it renders. Once you learn how to see the world that way, you can't turn it off, and it's so helpful. At the end of the day, any behavior happens for only one of two reasons: to attain, acquire something, or to escape, avoid something. This renders the function of a behavior down to binary code. Attaining, acquiring something is a 1, and escaping, avoiding something is a 0. In every scientific and mathematical sense, behavior can be reduced down to ones and zeros. If you can figure out what someone is trying to attain, acquire, or escape, avoid, you've identified the function of their behavior. Once you know that, you can affect what types of consequences meet them when they engage in the behavior, as well as prevent antecedents from presenting themselves that would set them off in the first place. Proactive strategies seek to prevent the behavior, where reactive strategies plan for what to do as the behavior still happens. Proactive prevention is more effective and healthier than allowing the behavior to happen and then having to react to it. The best behavioral intervention strategies proactively teach a socially appropriate replacement behavior that serves the individual better than the maladaptive behavior being replaced. Extinguishing the maladaptive behavior without replacing it with a learned skill leaves the individual to their own devices to cook up a new way to address the same want or need that drove the maladaptive behavior in the first place. If you don't give them a replacement behavior, they'll come up with one on their own that has a high likelihood of being as maladaptive as the behavior that was extinguished. Basically, it's not enough to make them stop. We have to reward them for doing something more appropriate instead. For example, one hypothetical solution to our current modern day problems with 47 and his administration could be that he negates all of his executive orders, voids all of his pardons of the J6 offenders, terminates his tariffs, resigns, and retires, and in exchange, upon assuming the presidency, J.D. Vance pardons him of all federal crimes. At that point, 47 could go live out the brief remainder of his life at his resort in Florida, surrounded by sycophants as the president who saved the economy by sacrificing his elected office, a hero of the people forever. This hypothetical scenario would still leave 47 vulnerable to prosecutions at the state level, but I'm willing to believe he would die of old age before he ever saw the inside of a jail cell. At this point, the world is so broken that it's unlikely that we'll be able to do much to hold him accountable. He's basically holding us hostage in exchange for a literal get out of jail card. He'd likely give up the presidency in exchange for simply being let off the hook. On a more personal level, that one crazy uncle, neighbor, sister in law, etc., who just doesn't get it cannot be responded to with logic, but you can change what kinds of consequences they receive when they engage in certain behaviors. Ignoring minor behaviors and being overly thankful and attentive when they behave appropriately goes a long way towards shaping their behaviors without them knowing it. Suggesting alternatives to conspiracy theories as questions rather than assertions allows them to arrive at the sensible conclusion on their own. You just need to plant seeds. If they say something crazy, you can say, "That's really interesting. I'm just wondering how they account for XYZ," and describe some logical aspect of the situation they hadn't considered. Follow it with, "Did they say anything about that?" Once you plant that seed of doubt in their minds, they're more likely to Google it later when you're not around to see if it means anything. If your logic blows their conspiracy theory apart, they may not come back and say anything to you about it. In fact, you may never hear about that particular conspiracy theory again. The more you pique their curiosity with innocent questions that don't imply you doubt them at all, the more they will figure it out on their own. They are far more likely to own it if it was their conclusion rather than someone else correcting them directly. If they do come back and say something about it, it's to say they looked into it and it turned out to be crap. The question you asked got to bugging them, and they had to look it up. When they did, they realized the whole thing was a bunch of BS. They may be chagrined, but nonetheless wiser. If you have a good relationship with them, they may even laugh with you about it and appreciate that you didn't make them feel stupid by correcting them and let them figure it out for themselves. You want to positively reinforce their curiosity, not positively punish their uninformed opinions. You want to positively reinforce their self-discovery of the truth. You want to ignore their misstatements of fact and or inaccurate conclusions and redirect them towards the truth with an innocent, curious question. Shift the blame for not understanding onto yourself when posing innocent, curious questions. Say things like, "I guess I'm just not getting it. Why do they do XYZ when ABC is happening? Or maybe it's just me, but I don't understand why they don't just do XYZ and call it good. Am I missing something?" End with comments like, "Wouldn't that be interesting to know?" Or, "Let me know if you ever find out anything about that." Keep it friendly and cordial, knowing that you are guiding them towards the truth in the kindest way possible, maintaining their dignity and not humiliating them when they finally own the truth. Punishing them for finally getting it defeats the whole purpose of trying to get them to get it. When they finally have their come to Jesus moment, it has to be rewarding for them to come to Jesus. There has to be forgiveness and mercy on the other side of that experience once they finally get it, or we'll lose them and we need them as allies to oppose the forces that would otherwise oppress us all. Conscripting them into the fight would not earn their devotion to the cause. They need to understand what is really going on so that they are invested in fighting for democracy with the rest of us according to a shared understanding of the facts. We need to earn their partnership by graciously helping them overcome their knowledge and skill deficits through reinforcing their appropriate behaviors and discouraging their inappropriate ones on a person by person, day by day basis, and only a public informed about ABA is going to be able to do that, hence this post and podcast. All of this further translates to what I've been building up to this whole time, which is discerning truth in media. When you can apply ABA principles in your day to day interactions with people without having to think about it, you will find yourself picking apart things in the media that don't add up. The functions of some people's behaviors will be suspect based on what consequences have rewarded them and won't match how they're being reported. With peer-reviewed research and other technical reports, the true test of validity is when other people can replicate the same study or practices and obtain the same or similar results. The more times different people come up with the same results doing the same things, the more reliable the science becomes. This is what we call an evidence-based practice. When people attempt to assert that something has been scientifically proven, a quick trip to scholar.google.com and a search on the topic will provide you with whatever science has been published on the topic. Some of it may be behind a paywall, but you can at least read the abstracts and see what their conclusions were. In any event, if something is legitimately supported by science, you can verify it this way. Similarly, when people say something is the law, ask them, which law? If they can't identify the actual law, or at least the section of the law, like state vehicle code or state education code, etc., then ask them where they learned it was the law and search the internet for trustworthy information about whatever they say in response. If it's case law from a court case, then they should know the name of at least one of the parties and where the case was tried. They may not know if it was state or federal, but they know what state it was in. Or they may not know the state, but they know it was a state case and not federal. They should have some details about which case it is if they're citing anything even possibly legitimate, in which case you can look it up through one of the many state or federal case lookup sites or just Google it. Pacer is the site I use for federal cases, but a Google search can often turn up the cases I'm looking for, state or federal, if I have enough information about them to feed into the search engine. Pacer is cheap, but it's not free like Google. The beauty of Pacer is that it will give you all of the publicly available records on a federal case once you've pulled it up. So you can see exactly what the court documents say and reach your own conclusions. Every state has its own unique system of case lookup portals that work in a similar fashion. Because most of the arguments that need to be won are between fact and fiction, graciously steering misinformed people to discover the facts for themselves from reliable sources of information allows them to come to more accurate conclusions on their own, become more educated voters, preserves their dignity, and allows them to become part of the pro democracy community with forgiveness and caring. Making sure you don't become one of the misled means looking to where the reliable data comes from and keeping things as simple as ones and zeros as possible. When you can reduce things down to their simplest expression, it's easier to figure out what to do. You have to eliminate all the noise of the pieces of data that aren't the most important and focus on the few that are critical in order to create a working system. You can tweak the details and make it pretty later, but you first need a functioning construct. Please do your own personal research into ABA and how it can be applied in your day to day life. I promise it will change your perspective on the whole world and equip you with skills to navigate the world around you better than anything else you could learn. What I've included herein is very basic, but I hope for our lay readers and listeners out there who are not already familiar with this science that I've given you a lot to think about and a new way to do it. I hope this information borrowed from my work in special education lay advocacy, paralegal support to attorneys, and educational psychology has translated well into information you can apply in your own unique life situations and that it serves you now and forever. Thank you for listening to the podcast version of using ABA to identify and deal with misinformation. KPS for Parents reminds its listeners that knowledge powers solutions for parents, and all eligible children, regardless of disability, are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. If you are a parent, education professional, or concerned taxpayer and have questions or comments about special education related matters, please email us at info@kpsforparents.org or post a comment to our blog. That's info@K as in knowledge, P as in powers, S as in solutions, the number 4, parents, PARENTS.org. KPS for Parents is a nonprofit lay advocacy organization. The information provided by KPS for Parents in making special education actually work is based on the professional experiences and opinions of KPS for Parents lay advocates and should not be construed as formal legal advice. If you require formal legal advice, please seek the counsel of a qualified attorney. All the content here is copyrighted by KPS for Parents, which reserves all rights.